California. Padres are doing well. I think as of yesterday, they were still in second place, though, but they're not about
We are live, Tim.
Huh?
We are live.
We are live. Okay. Welcome to all of you folks who are joining us from YouTube. We welcome you to our class today. We'll be getting started in about 4 minutes. The handout is being posted in the chat box here on Zoom. On Zoom. The one problem is that when we post a chat, there's so many folks who are joining us today and posting in the chat that that handout link just zooms by. Oh, it zooms by on Zoom. So if you wish to, you can go to the Family Search Research Wiki and go into classes and webinars on the Research Wiki and scroll down. Once you get into classes and webinars, scroll down to the U.S. Canada classes, and there will be a link to the handout there as well. But we will be posting the handout link in the chat at various times during the class. We're good. We're in Alberta. Okay, good for you folks who are coming on to there. The chat. The link to the handout has been posted again in the chat. We have many fine, wonderful people working in the background to make sure that your experience during this webinar is almost perfect. We're trying to perfect this. We have Colorado, we have Canada. Thank you all for joining us today for this class. I believe, how's your baseball team going, Tim? Oh, well, we're not going to talk about them. Actually, my baseball team, the Phillies, they didn't play last night, and they moved up from third to second place. So that may be the key to their season, just not play any games, and they don't play again tonight. So maybe by the end of the day, they'll be in first place. We have about 2 minutes to go here, and we will be starting with the class. The handout has been posted again in the chat. Arizona. Hello from Denver. Hello, Denver. Arkansas.
Tim, why don't you go ahead and get started with the housekeeping stuff so that we can start the class on time?
Okay, because I know you do have a ton of information. So we're going to get started with the housekeeping stuff. And again, we welcome all of you to today's webinar. I think you're all in for a treat today with today's class, Forgotten Wives, Mothers, and Old Maids, Tracing Women in U.S. Research. And our presenter today is going to be Beth Taylor. As always, though, we're glad you can join us. But before we do get started, or before Beth gets started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. As always, this class is being live streamed. You'll be able to review a recording of this class on the Family Search channel on YouTube. Note, however, that the recording will only be available for a limited time. Beth will be answering your questions at the end of the webinar. Please post your questions in the chat if you are joining us via Zoom, or in the comments section as we near the end of the presentation if you are on YouTube. If you're on Zoom and would like to have your questions and comments seen by everyone, please make sure that your chat messages are set to panelists and attendees. That is a little button below the chat box where it says to. Make sure that you have selected all panelists and attendees, and then everybody will be able to see what you are chatting about. If you need help with a specific research problem in your family, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our research specialists in a virtual consultation. And all you need to do for that is you go to the Family History Library's website or search virtual research strategy sessions on the Family Search wiki. Also, too, that will be posted in the chat. The link to that will be posted in the chat from time to time as the class goes on, particularly at the end of the class. In 2021, that's this year, the U.S. and Canada team from the Family History Library will be presenting classes on Thursdays at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, usually the first and third Thursdays of each month, except for December when we don't do any classes at all. The next class, which will be taught by the Family History Library, will be using the Family Search Catalog on Monday, June 7th at 10 a.m., again, Mountain Daylight Time. The next class, which will be taught by the U.S.-Canada team, will be the Knowles Collection. What is it and how do I use it? Which will be taught on Thursday, June 17th, again at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So that's the end of our housekeeping. So now let me introduce to you today Beth Taylor. And like I said, I believe that this class you are going to be in for just a treat today. This is a new class which which has not been taught before as far as I can remember. Again, the title of this class is Forgotten Wives, Mothers, and Old Maids, Tracing Women in U.S. Research. And Beth Taylor, our presenter, she works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family History Library. She holds a BA in history from Brigham Young and has worked for Family Search for 15 years. Her specialties and interests include Quakers, DNA, land records, probate records, organizing your research and records, and a whole bunch more. So we're just going to turn the rest of the time over to Beth for her class because, like I said, this is going to be just a fabulous class for all of us. So Beth, I'm turning the rest of the time over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to share some things about tracing women today. I feel like this is a big topic, and so there's a lot to talk about, so we'll see how much we get through today. The one thing I want to kind of just mention, though, is that the focus of the class today is going to be on more how do you find, like, what records are going to give information about your female ancestors, and a little bit of background on those records. Why do women appear in the records? So we're going to do some history, some legal history, and then we'll talk a little bit about strategies, what records to focus on when you trace women. The one thing I want to note is we're not really going to talk about, what's in the records as much. We'll show some examples, and we're not going to talk at all about how to find the records because there's a lot of great classes out there about the individual record types. I wanted to focus today more on that kind of big picture approach to finding women. So more the strategy and the background and the history, and a little bit less on actually finding the records. So let's go ahead and get started. So our objectives today, we're going to cover some just basic history and background about tracing women, and then kind of the big section, I want to talk about the law and the records they create, and specifically laws related to women, and again, when the women appear in the records. Then we'll kind of just cover some other records that you want to keep in mind because women don't just appear in legal records in the United States. And then we'll talk briefly about the importance of looking for women in the records of men. That's probably your top research strategy. And then we'll talk about some additional research strategies at the end of the class. So hopefully this is going to be fun. I love talking about some of this stuff. There's just so much to learn and kind of consider. So the first question I just want to address is, why is it hard to trace women? I mean, we kind of all know it is hard, but why is that the case? Well, there's a couple reasons. Probably one of the biggest is that women change their surnames constantly. Men tend to have one surname throughout their entire life, but because especially within Western European cultures, then women are going to change their surname every time they marry. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Overall, legal documents are less likely to name women. We'll talk about why that is again in a second. Any records that are created about women don't tend to be the records that are, in the courthouses and with the federal government. And those are the records that we tend to preserve, and those are the records that have survived. So if there are other records out there, they tend to be more in manuscript collections and things like that are a little harder to access. So if they do exist, those records are sometimes, again, they're not the records that we're going out and digitizing, because they're kind of more unique, and they're more one-off record sets as opposed to these big massive sets that we do tend to preserve. In a lot of ways, another thing to think about is that historically, men ran the government, men are in the military, and so men are, in a lot of the big, more public roles. So records are created by men, about men, and for men. So women are kind of more hidden, and so it's just harder to find them in the records, which is again why we end up looking at the records of men to find women. And we'll see several examples of that today. And then for a long time, because again, we were focused on much more of that public space where men are more prominent, history and historians haven't written about women for a long time, up until about the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, when historians started pursuing now a subset of history called social history, where you kind of tend to more look at, the history of people within the home and the household and the community, because that's where you'll see way more women in women's records and women's roles, just because of a few things. So, and then the other one, which we'll talk again about in a second, is women are actually not separate entities under the law for a lot of American history, a lot of the United States history. Okay, so changing surnames. This is one of the big reasons it's hard to trace women. And that's because when we do research, our full name is one of our identifiers to know that we're looking at the same person. That, John Smith over here, there's a John Smith in the records here and a John Smith in the records, and I shouldn't use John Smith. I should use a really obscure name, Jonathan Applebottom or whatever it is, that that it's the same person because the name matches. That's one of our big clues to tracing identities and tracking a person through records. But what happens when the surname changes almost every time you see him in a record set? How do you really know what's going on? So women do use multiple surnames throughout their life if they're married. Single women less likely to, but most of the women that we're looking for were married. That was kind of the standard for women, is that they get married and have families. So a woman is born either with their father's surname, or if you're looking at a Scandinavian country, they may have their father's given name, a variation, what we call patronymics. But then they're going to change to their husband's surname. And if they remarry, they may change to a second husband's surname. And if they remarry, they may change to another surname. So this is an example of a real woman who was born as Sarah Berry, and over time she became Sarah Howard, then Sarah McClure, then Sarah Taylor, then Sarah Stoneham, then Sarah Dippold. I'm probably saying the name wrong. But think about this. How do you really know that record that you found showing a woman named Sarah Berry is for about the same woman who is also later in a record listed as Sarah Stoneham? So sometimes tracking women through the records can be difficult because the surnames are changing. Another big reason that it's hard to trace women is because of what's called English common law. And most of the US legal system, for the most part, with the exception of the few of the states, originally everything was based off of this English common law. And English common law, of course, was the legal system in England. So it was brought to the United States by the early colonists. And under English common law, everything's built on what's called precedent. And there is another, a lot of like the Romance countries that speak Romance languages like France and Spain rely on something called civil law, which is another variation. We won't really talk about civil law, but sometimes women appear more under civil law than common law. But the big reason is because under common law, women were subject to something called coverture. This is actually from William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England in 1765. It's just pretty much the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband under whole wing protection and cover. She performs everything and is therefore called a femme couverte, and her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. So what this means is that women in a lot of ways don't have a separate legal existence, which means that they're not going to be doing all the legal things that produce records. so they're going to be harder to trace. So under English common law, a married woman is known as a femme couvert, and she cannot control or devise her own real property, meaning she can't decide who gets it after her death. She can bequeath personal property, but only with permission. She cannot appoint a guardian of her own children. She cannot sign contracts without permission. She can't be sued or be sued, witness a legal document, sign as a bondsman or surety. She just doesn't have a legal identity outside of her husband's. And what that just means is that she's appearing a lot less in the records. And that term coverture, you'll see this sometimes in the records, that due to her coverture just means she's covered by her husband's authority and protection. Now, kind of the other side, there's a femme couvert is somebody who's married. A femme soul is somebody who's widowed, single, or divorced, and they do have a lot more legal presence. So you do want to make sure that you're tracing the widowed, single, and divorced women in your ancestry as well, because they can do more. So as you know, a sister that never married may leave probate records, even if your direct female ancestor didn't. So Femme Soul can act as an executrix of a will or an administratrix of a probate. And just kind of a quick side note, if you ever see that suffix, the trix suffix actually is indicative that it's the feminine version in Latin. So you'll see things like executrix, administratrix, oratrix, testatrix, or if you're looking in deed indexes under grantor indexes, if you ever see et x, again, we've got that, the X in there, the trix in there, means and wife. So again, that particular suffix is something you want to watch for, because it is a clue that the person who's executing a will is actually female. Okay, so Femme Soul can also act as a guardian of her own children, again, because she might be widowed, purchase and sell property, sign contracts, and so forth. Now, there is a unique role. We're not going to talk about it beyond this today, but there is something called a Femme Soul traitor. There were situations in which a married woman was allowed to control her own property and act as if she were Femme Soul. Usually this is so she can run a business. For example, if she has her own, some kind of a business, she may be allowed to act on her own behalf, or if her husband has either abandoned her or he might be gone for long periods of time. Maybe he's a seaman or a merchant or something, and so she needs to have legal authority while he's gone, then they might be able to gain Femme Soul traitor status. Okay, so those are kind of some of the reasons why it can be difficult to trace women. But next up, what I want to get into is kind of some of the way those laws impact the records. We're going to talk about a couple different things. So the first thing that I kind of like to consider is that if the standard is that women don't appear in legal records, then you actually want to ask the question, then when and why do they appear in the records? Because if we can understand when a woman is going to appear in the records, then we can kind of understand what records to look for and in what capacity she's going to be in those records. So we're going to talk briefly about 4 kind of different areas that with the law. We'll talk about property and inheritance, a little bit about court and divorce. We'll talk about military service and widows' pensions, and then suffrage and citizenship. So these are just areas in which, the law kind of defines certain things, and then we want to see how that impacts women. So let's start with property and inheritance. Like we talked about just a minute ago, under English common law, marriage equals that unity of person, which means that a wife really doesn't have an independent legal status. Kind of already mentioned this. So she needs her permission or involvement to write a will. If she's going to bequeath personal property, like I mentioned, she cannot devise real property. If she's going to buy or sell property, she would need her husband's permission, or he would probably do it for her. If you sign a contract, sue or be sued, do anything business on behalf of the household, pretty much legally, she has to have her husband's involvement, or he does it without her. So she has to have his involvement, but he doesn't have to have her involvement under English common law, under coverture. So when it comes to the actual property of a woman, so let's say she gets married and she brings property into the marriage, maybe a dowry that's set aside by her father or some other way she already has property. Well, if she has personal property, that property is going to be, it just becomes her husband's property. It's no longer hers, it's his. So in a way, a married woman does not own personal property. It's legally, it's not considered hers. Now, if it's real property, that property is still hers legally, but it's actually not under her control. It's managed and controlled by her husband. And on a quick side note, if you've never heard these terms, personal versus real property, I mean, we still use the word real property in the phrase real estate, but it's much more common historically. But real property, the way to distinguish between what property is real and what property is personal is to whether or not it can be moved. So real property is not movable. So you think like a piece of land is real property. You can't, if you're going to move to the next county over, you don't pick up the piece of land and move it with you. Whereas personal property is movable. So the house would not be movable, but all of the accoutrements within the house are movable, would be considered personal property. So that's the difference. So all of that personal property that the wife brought into the marriage is her husband's by default. The real property is managed by him. And then if, for example, she has some real property that maybe she got from her father, anything that's produced from that property that's personal is now considered her husband's. So she doesn't even get to control the products of her real property. So pretty much he runs everything. And this is going to apply to any property that she brings into the marriage. So before her marriage, or any property that is either inherited or gifted to her during the marriage. Because in a way, she cannot purchase property because she has no personal property. She has no money with which to buy any other property, because all of that property is under her husband's control. Except, of course, if she's a Fem Soul traitor, which is, again, a unique situation. Now, there were situations in which there were reasons why they wanted to set off the wife's property as being separate from the husband's and give her a little bit more control. And these are sometimes called marital settlements or trust estates. They are not very, very common at all in the United States. They're a little more common in England. And usually it's a situation where maybe a father wants to make sure that the property for his wife for his daughter remains in his control. Or it could be a woman who is remarrying and she wants to make sure that the property that she got from her first husband's estate is kept separate from her second husband's estate and can't go to his creditors or anything like that. So they might do a marital settlement or a trust estate for that. Now, part of all of this, the way this all works, or part of the English common law, are something called Dower Rights. And this is actually really important to us as genealogists to understand dower. And dower rights are what widows are entitled to after their husbands die. So, the idea being that you don't want a man to die and his property to be divided up among the children and then the widow left destitute and dependent upon the state. So a widow is guaranteed a percentage or part of her husband's property. So she has, for the most part, and this is something where we're going to see this varies from state to state, but usually she gets a 1/3 what's called a life interest of any real estate that he obtained during the marriage. And then she also has she gets 1/3 of his personal property, whatever he owned. Now dower applies specifically when a husband left no will. So if he left a will, he can give her property, and you'll see sometimes the phrase, I give to my wife in lieu of her dower. So instead of her dower, this is what I want her to have. But in reality, no matter what the husband decided to do with his will, a widow could turn around and say, I don't want what I'm supposed to get out of the will. I want the dower. So sometimes when that happens, then they don't get the personal property. They only get the real property. The rules of dower are going to vary by jurisdiction and time period. So you really have to get to know your jurisdiction and time period. And just to note that dower did not exist in what are called common property states. There are 8 common property states: Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Washington. You'll notice they're all Western states that never had dower. Common property means the husband and wife own everything jointly or equally. Just a quick side note, if you're wondering, do men are they entitled to their widow's estate? They are, but they don't get a 1/3 interest. They have they get everything after a woman dies, leaving real property. Anyway, this is called courtesy. So a widow has a dower right and a man has a courtesy right. We won't kind of get into courtesy more than that. I just wanted you to be aware that there is a version of that. Now, what dower means, though, is that when property is sold, the wife of the person selling the property has to consent to the sale, because either she has a dower interest in that real estate because of, again, of that dower right, because it's any property obtained during the marriage for the most part, or she actually owns the property. It was the property that she inherited or brought into the marriage. She then therefore has to consent to the marriage, to the sale of the deed or the sale of the property. What this means is that a lot of the time, both the husband and wife will be listed as grantors on a deed. So land records are one place where we do see women named almost, whereas a lot of other records, they're kind of hidden. They are going to show up and you'll get at least their first name by tracing the land if your ancestor's husband owned property. So the wife would be listed as a grantor. She has to sign the document. And in most places, she also has to acknowledge publicly that she agrees to the sale, usually before a notary or justice of the peace. And then when they went to actually, part of that acknowledgement is that they would examine her separate apart, meaning they'd actually take her into a separate room away from her husband, read her the contents of the deed in case she could not read herself, and make sure that she approved of it. It kind of gave her that, they thought, that option to say, just kidding, I really don't want to sell this property. I'm being pressured into it by my husband. Now, not all three pieces are universal. It varies by time period and location. For example, Connecticut gave women no dower rights up until 1723, or the dower right was only in property owned at the time of death, which means that prior to 1723 in Connecticut, women are never named on land records. But just kind of be aware, though, that this dower right is really, really important. And again, one of the big places we're going to see women named in the records. So here's an example of a land record. This is from 1806 in Frederick County, Virginia. And I'm just going to pull out a couple pieces. We're not going to read through the whole deed, but the deed starts, this indenture made the 7th day of the 10th month, 1806, between Ezekiel Cleaver and Abigail Cleaver, his wife. So there we get Ezekiel and his wife's name. And the land is in Frederick County and Frederick County, Virginia, but the couple had actually moved to Warren County, Ohio, which means that in order to get the release of dower and have the wife examined separate and apart, the clerk of Frederick County actually wrote to the sheriff of Warren County, Ohio, and said, will you go out to the property and get her dower release? And so the sheriff did, and then wrote a note back to the court in Frederick County, and it gets reported that they did go out and get the dower release from Abigail, the wife of Ezekiel. So again, keeping in mind that suddenly we actually do see women named in land records. It's one record set that they're there more than almost any other set, especially if you're looking at colonial US or early US records. Now, the English common law, which had, for the most part, most colonies and states were relying on English common law or had passed laws that supported most of the tenets of English common law. A lot of that started to change in about the 1840s, 1850s, but with the passage of what are called Married Women's Property Acts. Because land ownership is defined by the states, again, this is going to vary when these passed and what they do. It varies by time period and by state. And, they'll pass one act and then they'll pass another act that gives them more power or more abilities. But again, these are state statutes. And what happens is that they kind of start to give women legal status, and they give women more control of their own property. So Mississippi is the first one to pass what we consider one of these acts, and mostly just protected dowers against their husband's creditors. So, and there are a few other states that passed some other acts in the 1840s, but the big act that we oftentimes refer to the most is the New York Married Women's Property Act of 1848. And I included a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton here because Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and a number of other women, they met at Seneca Falls in 1848 and wrote what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this idea of giving women more control of their own property was one of their early pushes, something that they were very interested in. So these property acts, for the most part, put a married woman's real and personal property under her control. And they said that that property could no longer be subject to her husband's debts. This was a really big area people were concerned about, that, you know, a widow inherits and then the creditors can come after that property, even dower in some places. It allowed women to sign contracts, married women, and it also allowed them to decide what happened to their property after their death. So they can now start to write wills and devise property. What these acts led to was a huge increase in women actually buying and selling property. And where really we saw an increase is a lot of women starting to write wills. And that includes a lot more single and divorced, or single and women, and also widows. Because up to that point, widows didn't really have a lot of control over their own real property and what would happen to it, but now they do. And so we'll see, you know, up to, after this point, maybe up to 40% of wills will be written by women. So, you know, looking for your female ancestors who after this time period, start looking in those probate records and see if they left a probate. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. This is a deed. And this is a deed, this is in Montgomery County, New York. So same place as we had the Married Women's Property Act of 1848. This is a deed in which Peter R. Flint and Sally Flint, his wife. So we're still seeing that where we get the couple together selling the property. But they actually give property to Sarah Jane Wendell, wife of Oscar Wendell, who was their daughter, and the considerations for the natural love and affection and sum of $1. I think I put that in there wrong. But the one thing that's really key here, though, is that prior to 1848, it's much more likely they would have given the property to Oliver, or to Oscar, I apologize, to Oscar, the husband. But at this point, now they're giving it to her independent of him. So now Sarah Jane herself owns property, and she's a married woman, and she has control of that property. Now, on the same date, I was a good researcher, and I looked at the deed records around that one. They also gave some property to a William Flint of Minden, the same location that the property was in. But at the same time period, there's kind of an interesting deed in which Peter and Sally sold 2 pieces of property to Oliver, and I put Oliver there. It's Oscar and Oliver. It's one or the other. I think it's really Oscar. I apologize. But Oscar and Sarah Jane, they sell 2 pieces of property to Oscar and Sarah Jane. And then in the same date, for the same amount of money, Oscar and Sarah Jane turn around and sell those same 2 pieces of property, not back to Peter and Sally together, but to Sally on her own, which means that Sally, Peter's wife, now also has property. I think that because of the complexity of property law, that it was easier for Peter and Sally to, you know, sell the property and then have it be sold back than for Sally to just, for the 2 of them to just decide that Sally gets this property. I've seen this happen a couple of other times as well. But what that means, though, is that now Sarah Jane has property in her own name as a married woman, and Sally has property in her own name as a married woman. So again, we're seeing the impact of the Married Women's Property Acts. And now because Sally Flint had property, we can also find a will that where she actually will devise that real property that she gives to a different son. So here's her, I just kind of pulled out some details from her will. Sally Flint, she signs her will in 1862, approved 1863. And I'm just highlighting there that she gives all of her real estate, and including the 30 acres on Sprout Brook, which is actually the land from the deed. And in the will itself, she actually says, see deeds, volume 69, page 435, which is what we just looked at. She gives all of that to one of her sons. Okay, so property inheritance, for the most part, we don't see them except in those deed records. And then starting in the 1840s, we're going to start seeing them kind of, they're not going to be hidden as much anymore because the law changed to allow them legal status. So next, let's talk briefly about court and divorce. Now, I won't get into a lot of details about court records, but just as with the land and property, land and probate, you have to consider, why are women going to go to court? There are situations where they may be involved in court cases. There are court cases in which a woman acted in a legal manner without her husband's consent, and then the husband was upset about it. He might, take her to court over it. There might be a lawsuit in there. Women can join a husband's lawsuit. They just can't file separately. So either they might join a lawsuit or they might act as a witness. There are still criminal proceedings against women. So especially think about crimes that are kind of more unique to women. Things like having a child out of wedlock might result in a court case, especially really early colonial America, or things like prostitution or other situations. You will see women. A woman can be indicted separately from her husband. So criminally, they're not considered the equal person, though there was a hesitancy, from what I can tell, to prosecute women because they felt that would deprive their husbands of her services. So that she might get fined more than sent to jail. Women also get committed to asylums, probably at a higher rate than men. There are a lot of mental health issues that are unique to women, postpartum depression and so forth. But one of the big ways that women can interact with the court, and the one big situation in which they act independent of their husbands, is when they want to sue for divorce, when they want to end the marriage. So let's take a quick look at divorce by itself. Under English common law, the expectation is that a husband is required by law to support his wife. So what happens when he doesn't do that? Either he abandons her, or he's living with another woman, or something else is happening. And that's where divorce comes into play. So women were allowed to sue for divorce. Men are also allowed. We're going to focus though on why women would sue for divorce. But they had to sue for cause. Modernly, we have a lot more no-fault divorces where you just go in and get a divorce. The marriage didn't work out. That was not the case historically. You actually had to have a reason behind it. The big three types are cruelty, neglect, and adultery. And there are actually two types of divorces granted. There are what are called absolute divorces, and I'm not going to say the Latin version because I'm not very good at pronunciation. But under an absolute divorce, the woman was now considered a Fem Soul and was allowed to remarry. Absolute divorces actually originated in ecclesiastical courts in England. When they came to the US, the question was who could do an absolute divorce, since it had to be handled supposedly by an ecclesiastical court. And of course, New England saying, we're not Church of England. So they went ahead and handled that on a civil level. And in some of the southern states never actually did absolute, or southern colonies never did absolute divorces, because again, this issue of if there's no state church to take care of it, then what do we do? So a lot more common were the other type of divorces, which are aumento et thoro, or translated from bed and board. Sometimes they refer to this as a soft divorce. But under a soft divorce, a woman is still considered a femme couvert, which means that she can't remarry. She's still legally under her husband's control. However, they do live separate and apart, and her husband has to pay a maintenance fee of some kind so that she can survive. Like I said, a lot more absolute divorces in the New England colonies, and then you get more common, the other type, more common in the southern colonies. And then, of course, over time, things have changed, but divorce is handled by different jurisdictions. So if you think that a divorce happened, you need to look at different places. Initially, in some states, divorce is a legislative action from the state. So for states that had chancery courts, those were usually the courts that handle it. A chancery court, or sometimes known as a court of equity, they originally were responsible for handling all of the marital settlements or estate trusts. So because they were already handling that, that's why divorce kind of came under their control as well. And then over time, it's circuit courts and county courts and other courts that can handle divorce. But again, looking time period and location is key to understanding where and how to find the divorce cases. Just note that judges did not always grant divorce. Just because you sued did not mean the judge was going to grant it. I think I've seen a case where a woman walked into a bar because her husband was stepping out on her and shot him, and the judge still didn't grant a divorce. They were living together in the next census. Okay, the requirements also varied by state. Usually there was a requirement for a certain length of residence in the state. There would also be requirements about things like citizenship, which can be a little more complicated, as we'll talk about naturalization in a minute. And then there are cases where some states had laxer divorce laws, and so migratory divorce also became common, where you'd actually move to a new state for the purposes of getting divorced. I read that actually Indiana for a while had the laxest divorce laws. And so a lot of people would move to Indiana to establish residency for long enough that they could get a divorce. Some kind of grounds for divorce, this is from 1895, included things, initially the causes were small, and then over time you get more and more different kinds of reasons you can get divorced. Things like adultery, abandonment, or desertion, but how long you'd been abandoned was key. So how many years ago did he abandon you? And if he'd ever returned to the state, sometimes the judge might not grant a divorce. Drunkenness is a pretty common one, or intemperance, cruelty or inhumane treatment, criminal conviction, failure to provide, voluntary separation, and more. If you're looking at grounds for divorce, also commitment to an asylum would be a grounds for divorce. And that's why there are stories told of men who wanted to get rid of the current wife for a new wife, who would commit their first wife to an asylum for the purposes so that he could now have grounds for divorcing and get married to somebody else. So here's an example of a complaint from a divorce file. I don't want to look at the whole thing, but I just want to notice this is a woman named Tennessee Boaz against Samuel F. Boaz. This was filed in 1873 in Madison County, Mississippi. And kind of the information you get in these divorce cases is varied, but also really, really interesting. She's complaining because pretty much Samuel is drunk all the time, and he's not a nice drunk, he's a pretty mean drunk. But it does give us our date of place in marriage. So if you're struggling to find marriage, but they got divorced, the divorce case will include that. So they married on the 19th of March, 1861 at Madison County. She tells a little bit in this initial complaint. She says that she's always lived with him since their marriage in 1861, except for when she was forced by his drunkenness and inhumane and cruel treatment to go to her father's house for protection. So if you went through the whole divorce proceedings, what would you expect to find? You'd probably expect to find that her father, so if you don't know who her father was, would come into court and, testify on her behalf and tell what he saw, because I'm sure he's supporting her petition for divorce. And then this also gives us the clue that they had one daughter together, so who was 12 years of age. So divorces can be, valuable. They're a little bit tougher to find. They're less likely to be online or anything, but they still, if you think there's a divorce, make sure you see if you can find that divorce case. Next, I want to talk about suffrage and citizenship. And I just want to highlight the picture on the screen, which you can't tell by the picture itself, is actually from the 1913 March on Washington, which was the largest march to date the largest march in Washington to date in 1913 was a group of women who gathered they wanted voting rights, pretty much. That's what suffrage is voting rights. And I've just got Susan B. Anthony here because she was hugely involved in the push for voting rights. So she didn't live long enough to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. And we've talked a lot about suffrage the last year because it's the 100th anniversary. It was the 100th anniversary, and so there's a ton of great exhibits online if you want to learn more about suffrage. I don't want to talk too much about it because it's true that we will see women start to show up in the voting registers after that date. But note that there are time periods in which women could vote prior to 1920. So, for example, New Jersey actually allowed women to vote from about 1776 to 1807. It's because their original voting rights laws never said that it was only men who could vote, which, because they didn't include women, then women would vote mostly in local elections. But then in 1807 that got changed. But then kind of more modernly, a lot of the Western states have given women the right to vote starting as early as 1869 for Wyoming. Utah gave women the right to vote from 1870, which they lost in 1887 and then brought back in 1896. Washington, Montana, Colorado, all of these states gave women the right to vote before that 19th Amendment. So make sure that if you're tracing your female ancestors, for example, California, the Ancestry has a bunch of these voting registers, and I can find my great-grandmother voting in 1912 in the federal elections, because California had given women the right in 1911. But the one reason I bring up suffrage is because how closely suffrage and voting rights actually tie into citizenship and naturalization. because voting is one of the benefits of being naturalized. So let's talk a little bit about women in naturalization and citizenship. The one thing to note is that immigrant women always had the right to become citizens. There's never a time where they said, oh, women can't become citizens. It's just that path to citizenship is kind of varied. The original Naturalization Act of 1790 did not mention women at all. It provided for derivative citizenship for minors. Talk about derivative citizenship in a second, but it did not name women. So the first time that we really see women named in those acts in any sense is in 1804. And so in 1804, and this lasted all the way up to 1934, if an alien, a man, is naturalizing and he starts the process, naturalization is it's a three-part process. First, papers or the declaration of intent is filed. Then a few years later, then you get a petition, and then you get a certificate of naturalization. But what happens if the man dies mid-process? So he's filed his first papers, but not his second papers. Well, they said that then the widow, his widow, and along with any deceased minors, could just go in and become naturalized by signing or declaring an oath of allegiance in a court. So they didn't have to go through any kind of a naturalization process because he had already been in process. This was in effect from 1804 to 1934. The next time that we really see women in the naturalization laws is in 1855, in which women were granted what's called derivative citizenship. Derivative citizenship is just the idea that if you marry a citizen, you are now a citizen just by virtue of your marriage. And then if you married an alien, if he then naturalizes, you gain that citizenship by virtue of that marriage. And just note that Native American women, there's a few laws that will add to that in 1888. Native American women who married citizens gained citizenship, and then, but yeah. Then in 1907, they kind of, because there's a lot of questions after 1855, is then if we're saying that a woman becomes naturalized by marrying a citizen, then what happens if she marries an alien? And there were a lot of judges who were kind of arguing that it meant that she would lose her naturalization, or her citizenship status by marrying somebody who's not a citizen. But that didn't actually become federal law until 1907, when a woman's naturalization was completely tied to her husband's citizenship status. So if she married an alien, so if she married a citizen, she becomes a citizen. Or if her husband, naturalizes, she becomes a citizen. However, if she married an alien, she actually lost her citizenship. So suddenly all these women from 1907 to 1922 who were born in the US will actually lose their citizenship just simply by marrying a man who is not a citizen. In some cases that her husband may not have been eligible to become a citizen. There were, like the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented those of Chinese origin from becoming a citizen. So if you married somebody who just couldn't become a citizen or who never bothered to, a woman permanently lost her citizenship status. And in this kind of in the same vein, if she was married to an alien, she could not naturalize without her husband. So in this time period, women's entire citizenship status is tied to her husband's if she's married. So if she has to go prove that she's naturalized for any of this time period, do you think how complicated that starts to get? You might have to provide, your husband's naturalization papers and your marriage papers. And this becomes important if you ever look at federal land, like for example, under the Homestead Act, where you could get 160 acres for free, plus the cost of filing, but you had to be a citizen to do it. That becomes a little bit complicated in that time period, because how do you actually prove that you're a citizen if you're female, like if you're a widow? Or I've seen a case actually where we had a widow who had married twice, divorced the first time, and in order for her to prove that she was naturalized, she had to show her, and both of her husbands had been born outside the country, she had to prove that her first husband had naturalized. She had to prove that that she had married her first husband, because that's when she was actually gained her citizenship. She had to prove that she divorced her first husband. She had to prove that she'd married her second husband. And because she was actually completing his homestead process to begin with, she also had to prove her second husband's naturalization, what actually came about because of his service in the Civil War. So for her to just prove her own naturalization took like 8 documents. It gets really, really complicated if you think about it. Starting in 1922, women were given the phrasing is that they now have their own nationality for the first time. It's no longer tied to the nationality of their husbands. And this came about primarily because of, if you think about it, it comes about because of suffrage. Because now that women had the right to vote, judges who were naturalizing a man felt that they had to verify that the man's wife also qualified for naturalization. Like one of the key requirements for naturalization at that time period, for example, was speaking English. And you had a lot of couples where the husband could speak English, but the wife, who was still, living within a community from her own country of origin, may not speak English. So they were denying men naturalization because their wives couldn't speak English. And this started to become an issue. And of course, so then in 1922, what's called the Cable Act was passed, which allows women or requires married women to naturalize separately from their husbands. So it ends derivative citizenship for married women. The one caveat that they allowed for women is that if a woman was married to a citizen, she doesn't have to file the first papers, she just files the second papers. So they do skip a step. But at this point, women no longer lose their citizenship by marrying an alien. And then, and I forgot to put it in there, in 1924, of course, then I think it's 1924 that I might have the year wrong, that at around the same time period, Native Americans as a whole, including Native American women, were now considered citizens of the US and could vote. So all Native American women would be given that right to vote. One kind of final note is that there was still a group of women from 1907 to 1922 who lost their citizenship and they kind of felt like they shouldn't have to completely naturalize and complete the whole process. So starting in 1936, there was a kind of a way made that if they had lost their citizenship in that time period, all they had to do was take an oath of allegiance to regain their citizenship, which is actually producing a really cool record set called the Repatriation Files that are available at one of the National Archives. So here's an example. We've got both the Declaration of Intention and a petition for naturalization for a woman named Martha Margaret Carimo. And it gives us, here's her petition. It tells us she was born in 1895 in Finland, which was formerly Russia, and that she had immigrated in 1903, which means she immigrated as a child. Her father probably never naturalized. This is a single woman. You'll notice that she actually files her declaration of intent in 1923, naturalizes in 1925, because up until that point, there was no real reason for her to naturalize. If you can't vote, why naturalize? That was one of the big benefits to naturalization. And here's another example. This is a woman, Ella Iglesias, who was born in 1885 at Baltimore, Maryland. She's always resided in the US. And why is she naturalizing? Because her husband, Enrique, was born in Mexico. So this is a situation where she is trying to regain her citizenship through the naturalization process. This is before she could just do an oath of allegiance. So next, I just want to touch on women in the military. So in the 18th and 19th century, women were primarily camp followers. There was no formal military service, but there were a lot. I think they're saying like 25,000 women were involved in the American Revolutionary War as camp followers. Just a lot of women involved, and they did a variety of tasks. Cooks, seamstresses, laundresses. They might have been the families. Some soldiers brought their wives with them. Some women actually followed men onto the battlefield. During the Civil War, there were a group of women that were known as the Daughters of the Regiment. And we do hear stories, of course, of women who were disguised as soldiers or who maybe acted as spies. But the big thing here with this time period is that, except for maybe some of those women who were disguised as soldiers or spies, none of these women really get named in the records, and they never get things like pensions or any benefits from what they did. They're not really considered veterans of the military. So there's just not a lot of clues about who these women were, but they were around. The other thing to keep in mind with 18th and 19th century battles or wars, that they were all fought on American soil, which means that women are probably also, women at home are also seeing the after effects of what's going on with the military, because maybe there were battles on their land or people marching through. And so some of those women at home may have also done things like carry messages or, move contraband or track troop movements for the other side and pass messages, even though they were at home and managing the household while their husband was off at war. Now, in terms of actually serving in the military, the first time that women are considered to have served in the military was in the Civil War, when there were nurses in the armies. The nurses start to be are considered members of the military. There were 3,000 nurses in the Union Army. There were also volunteer nurses as well as nurses in the Confederate Army, but I wasn't seeing numbers for those. But for the most part, they didn't, even though they served, it took a while until they could qualify for pensions. They didn't qualify until 1892, volunteer nurses in 1912, and then they could be buried at Arlington starting in 1896. And I've included a picture here of Dorothy Dix, who was one of the kind of matrons of the nurses movement in the Civil War. She was very prominent. By the Spanish-American War, however, there was kind of a realization that female nurses were somebody that they started recruiting for nursing staff. And so they recruited 1,500 nurses who actually, for this first time, they're the first women who are sent overseas as part of their service. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901, the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. And then by World War I, I think as many as 20 to 30,000 nurses served in World War I and 60,000 in World War II. And all of these women, a lot of these women were serving at the front lines in really dangerous positions. So, but they were there for their medical skills. And other than the number of nurses, World War I was the first time that women did serve in the military. And I think it's so easy, growing up, I always thought that women just didn't serve in the military until recently, but they were involved in World War I. So in 1916, the first was called a National Service School was established. There's actually, these were kind of female versions of these training camps put together for men, because there's kind of this expectation that the US might join the war going on in Europe, but nothing had happened yet. And so they started putting together these kind of like 3 or 4 week camps where you could go out and learn some skills. So in case, we entered World War I. So there were schools or opportunities for women to do that as well as men. Like I said, World War I is the first time that women could openly serve in the military outside of nursing, but they served mostly in support roles. I saw numbers as high 25 to 35,000 women served in World War I. The Navy, the rank that the women were given was Yeoman F, or they would call these yeomanettes, because the Navy had failed to include any notes in the act that allowed them to recruit. It never said that you could only recruit men. The Army did, but the Navy didn't. And so the Navy went out and recruited a bunch of women. And they did a lot of the clerical, administrative kind of support roles were very, very popular for women. Then the Army Signal Corps had what were called the Hello Girls. They also recruited women because the Army, for the first time ever, could use telephones in World War I, and they needed people to kind of operate the telephones. And it turns out they needed skilled people who could already do it. And in the US at the time, about 85% of all telephone operators were female. So they went out and recruited women who were telephone operators who could speak French and some of the other languages. And then those were the ones sent to the front. However, because the Army said that you had to be a man to serve, they were considered civilians and didn't receive any of the benefits of being veterans until 1979, which is a little late. By World War II, I saw a variety of numbers of the number of women who served in World War II, anywhere from 140,000 all the way up to 350,000. And they mostly served in corps that were auxiliary to the men's corps. So we had the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which eventually became the Women's Army Corps, which is the only corps that actually did send women overseas. And the Women's Army Corps also had regiments that were African American and Asian American as well. Then you get things like the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. They were sometimes the test pilots for new aircraft, or they would fly planes between various bases and things like that. You have the Coast Guard Women's Reserve, who were known as the SPARs. The Marine Corps had a reserve. And then Navy had the WWIIs, Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. So lots and lots of women serving in World War II. And they filled over 200 different non-combat roles. So make sure that you're looking for your female ancestors in the military, because just because we kind of think, yeah, it's mostly men, there are a lot of women who did it, and they will have records for their service. I actually realized I I attended my great aunt's funeral a few years ago, and I hadn't realized that she'd actually served in the Women's Army Corps. And so she was considered she is a veteran, and so they did an honor guard at her funeral, which was really awesome to see. So here's an example of, a lot of World War I and World War II records are harder to access at this point, but I did pull this from the Veterans Administration pension payment cards database and family search. But here is a payment card for a woman whose service was a nurse in the medical department of the US Army. So again, they do appear in the records. We just need to go looking for them. The other big way that women are going to be in the records with military is for widows' pensions. Just as women could get a pension for the service of their husband if they were a widow. Sometimes there was a distinction between men who died in that particular war and then veterans who died later. So we'll focus mostly on veterans who died later. So for the widows of the Revolutionary War, they started qualifying for widows' pensions in 1832 if they had married before the war, 1836 if they married during the war, 1838 if they married before 1794, 1848 if they married before 1800, and by 1858, all Revolutionary War widows qualified for pensions. The widows of the War of 1812 veterans qualified for pensions there were two big acts, 1871 and 1878, and the Mexican War is 1887. In addition, as we get into the Civil War, in 1861, they did start offering pensions for widows and dependent mothers if the soldier was killed during the war. And they kind of updated that in 1864, and that said that, because one of the rules was you had to provide a marriage record. But by 1864, we had the United States Colored Troops, which Lynn did a great class on the colored troops a few weeks ago if you're more interested in them. But the problem is that the widows of the colored troops could rarely prove that they had married because they really couldn't marry prior to that point. So they allowed for that a widow could apply for a pension if she could prove that she had lived together as husband and wife. So whenever I see things like that, I think, well, what does that mean for the records? Is you're going to get some really awesome records of people saying, yes, this couple lived together as husband and wife prior to his service in the Civil War. Then in 1890, they started offering pensions for veterans, and that included widows of veterans, so anyone who had been honorably discharged. And these are Union pensions, but the Confederate States, so if you served for the Confederate Army, you had to get your pension from a state, not from the federal government. And they did, most of the Confederate States, not all of them, offered widows' pensions starting as early as 1879 for Georgia, as late as 1915 for Arkansas. So you have to go learn about the state where your widow was living, because sometimes you could apply from the state of residence, not just the state where your husband had served. The other thing that widows were allowed was bounty land. And there's a lot of acts that gave soldiers or veterans bounty land, depending on various wars. But the big three acts that provided this was the acts of 1850, 52, and 55. And in 1850, widows of veterans of the War of 1812 and the Indians Wars were allowed bounty land, but the acreage was based on the length of service of their spouse, of their husband. However, if their husband had been killed in battle during that particular war, they automatically received 160 acres. By the Act of 1852, they allowed a widow who had remarried after the veteran, she qualified if she was not currently married at the time of application. And then the Act of 1855 expanded the benefits to widows of Revolutionary War veterans, and allowed anybody to have 160 acres total, regardless of service. So sometimes somebody who had gotten land under the Act of 1850 might then go back and get additional land under the Act of 1855. So there might be multiple bounty land warrants for one widow. So let's take a look at some examples of this. So here we've got, this is a bounty land warrant application, or bounty land application filed under the Bounty Land Act of 1850. And we have this widow, her name's Divine Embry. And actually she, part of applying for either a widow's pension or for bounty land is that you had to prove your marriage, which is really awesome if they married in a time and a place where those records no longer exist. So in this document, she just kind of writes it out as a petition, but she says She was married to Merrill Embry, who was her spouse, in Oglethorpe County, Georgia. This is all in Georgia, on the 6th of December, 1804, and her name before her said marriage was Divine Howard. And then she goes on and gives, more information about her husband when he died, and that he was never married other than to her, because that was also a big issue. Here's an example of a widow's pension from the Civil War. This is they actually went back to the court to initially issued the marriage, and then they wrote out a certificate that said there is a record of this marriage in this court. So here we've got the kind of a duplicate of the marriage is in the pension applications. We have John Knoblaw and Lida Klaus, who married on the 13th of April, 1866, by David S. Byers, a minister of the gospel. And that's copied by the current clerk, this is in 1910, by the current clerk onto a kind of certificate that then gets submitted with the widow's pension. But I mean, that's really awesome information to find out about a woman that you get from her widow's pension. Or this is from the same widow's pension. A lot of times they would include affidavits of people who had known them for a long time to say, yeah, I know that they were really married. And in this particular individual, his name's Aaron Dunbar, he actually writes in his little witness affidavit, he says, I know that, first off, he knows that John Knoblaw had never married anyone other than, she calls her Miss Eliza Klaus. She went by Lida sometimes. But then he actually tells us a little bit about Eliza before her marriage. I also have known Mrs. Eliza D. Knoblaw ever since she was a schoolgirl. Makes me kind of wonder if they went to school together, and know from my personal knowledge that she was not married, as I've known them both ever since they became of marriageable age. And I was a number of Mrs. Knoblaw's father. And then he actually served with John in the military in the Civil War. So the great thing here, though, is that maybe I haven't been able to figure out who Eliza's parents were, but if I can go trace down Aaron Dunbar, I know that he should live near Eliza when she's a child. Okay, so those are kind of the big legal things. And then the next, I just want to touch briefly on some of the other records. Make sure that you're going beyond just legal documents, because there are some limitations with women in legal documents and documents created by laws, just because of those issues with women not always being a legal entity. But other records you want to look at, don't forget things: census records, vital records, passenger lists, church records, cemetery records and headstones, newspapers, city directories, school records. Remember that when I'm talking not just about school records for when they're children, but remember a large number of women also became school teachers for a few years before they married. So check up on local normal schools. A normal school is a school that trains school teachers. So quickly with census records, 1790 to 1840 census listed the head of household. So, you're not going to get women unless they happen to be the widow. Usually that's where you find them, and they're still maintaining their own household. However, in 1840, they do list the names of the widows of Revolutionary War veterans on the census schedule. So don't skip over those columns. Right? Of course, 1850, we get the name of anybody in the household. You want to look also for things like the kind of more unique schedules, like the mortality schedules from 1850 to 1880. Starting in 1880, we get marital status, which, we can kind of figure out, who's married, who's widowed, and we get relationships. And then there's like the 1880 defective, dependent, and delinquent schedules, which are really great because we do know a lot of women ended up in asylums or in almshouses because they don't have a lot of money to support themselves, and so they do end up in the poorhouses, or they are more likely to be committed to asylums. So, check the DDD schedules, especially if you look at the regular 1880 census and it says they're living in an almshouse, or it marks that they have an infirmity. So here's an example of the DDD schedule for Sussex County, Delaware. I just highlighted 3 women down here at the bottom: Mary Lecates, Mary Hickman, and Margaret Benson. It gives us where they traditionally reside, Baltimore for 2 of them. And then it says that it gives us a clue as to whether they are intemperate. It actually asks that question: is this person regularly drunk, pretty much? And then it does tell us a little bit about what they all ended up in this county almshouse. One has epilepsy and 2 are crippled. And it tells us the date in which they have since how long they've been at that almshouse. So a little bit more information than what you traditionally get on a census schedule or on these DDD schedules, the defective, dependent, and delinquent schedules. A couple other censuses. Starting in 1880, women could be hired as enumerators. 1900 to 1910 asked the number of years married and the number of children born and living to a woman. By 1930, it asked the age at first marriage. 1940 gives you who the informant was. And we've oftentimes guessed that the woman was often the informant, but there hasn't been evidence of that until the 1940 census. So we can start seeing which of our female ancestors actually provided the information. And then the 1940 census, I think we sometimes forget, asked sample questions or supplementary questions. So 2 people on every census schedule were asked additional questions. And for married women, they were actually asked 3 additional questions. So if your ancestors on a supplementary line, make sure you're looking down at the bottom. But they asked if they'd been married more than once, their age at first marriage, and the number of children ever born. So here's an example. We've got the 1940 census. Here's Edith May Peak. She's on line 68, and you'll notice to the left, it just has a little thing that says supplementary questions, and that's when you go down to the bottom of the page. And there's a lot of questions asked, place of birth of mother and father, if you're a veteran, if you have Social Security. But then here we've got for all women who are or who have ever been married, that's where they ask those 3 questions. So this particular woman had not been married more than once. She married at age 17 and she had 9 children. Okay, we also want to look for vital records, and birth and death are very valuable, but marriage records are one of the key records for tracing women because they list maiden name. They list the name that they were using. They list another name, but the name they're using at the time of the marriage. Oftentimes that's the maiden name, but for women who remarry, that could be an earlier husband's name. But again, earlier I mentioned this importance of, looking at identity and tracing, trying to make sure that you have the same person, and marriage is a way of connecting a married name and a maiden name. But keep in mind though, also in addition to that marriage records, you want to watch for some things like how old did you have to be to legally marry without consent. So brides who usually had to be 18 and grooms 21. But if they were under that legal age, you might get a consent affidavit or a note somewhere that says, I'm the guardian of so-and-so and I give consent for the marriage. Well, that's really huge because that's a parent or guardian. And if you're trying to figure out parents, you need to find those consent affidavits. Also, keep in mind that there were oftentimes residency requirements around the bride about how long a couple had to live, or she had to live in an area before she could get married there. Sometimes it's 6 months. And that's because traditionally, a couple marries at the place of the bride's residence. So their marriage location might be key to finding her parents because we'd expect her parents to be nearby. Also look for cemetery records. Headstones can list maiden names. You see a lot of relationships on headstones. But in addition to that, go and talk to the person running the cemetery and see if you can figure out who bought the plot and who else is buried in the same plot, because maybe she's buried with her parents, especially if she died pretty young. And then also look at neighboring plots. One thing to note is if you are looking at relationships on headstones, and sometimes in obituaries and a few other places, there are 2 kind of vocabulary words that are terms that you might see, which are consort and relict. And a consort just means that the husband is still living. So if this woman was the consort of, then her husband died after her. If she's a relict, she was probably predeceased by her husband. Those are kind of the standard definitions of those 2 terms. So a couple examples here. We've got a headstone for a Sarah Byers Klaus. You'll notice we actually got her maiden name on the headstone. I love it when that happens. Or sometimes you just get the relationships. Here's Nancy, the wife of William Hamilton. Again, a good. Anything we get with relationships can help with that figuring out identity issue that we're talking about. Also make sure that you're looking for newspapers. Newspapers are probably one of the best sources, especially once you hit the latter half of the 19th century. They're a great source for tracing women. Look for the traditional stuff like obituaries or marriage announcements, but sometimes you'll find marital issues in the gossip columns. And women were hugely involved in societies and organizations, which are going to be reported on by the newspaper. So when you figure out that your ancestor, if you can figure out what society she belonged to, make sure that you're not just looking for your ancestor in the paper, also look for the society itself, because you can assume that if she's involved in the society for part of her life, then she's probably doing those same events. So it's a great way of kind of seeing what kind of those biographical details. I also kind of wonder, when I read some of these newspapers, oftentimes they'll have like a section, this newspaper is published in, the county seat, and then somebody will write in from all of the little towns and give the gossips. I've wondered if a lot of those correspondents are female. We don't really know because there's no authors written, but there's nothing that says they have to be male. So those could be written by some of the women of the town. Let's take a look at some examples of newspapers of obituaries. Here's an obituary for actually my great grandmother, Mrs. Ben Taylor. Of course, she's getting her husband's name. That happens a lot too. So when you're searching for women in newspapers, make sure you're looking for the men in their lives, because might be Mrs. So-and-so. But we do get some background information on her, that she was born in Reed City, Michigan in 1880 as Miss Fanny Souls. And she came to California and attended the Los Angeles Normal School. And in 1906, she taught the one teacher Wildemar School, where she met Ben F. Taylor, who was a clerk of the school trustees, and married him. In addition, though, we also get a clue about the societies that she was involved in. Like I mentioned, this is a great way of kind of building out her fan club and kind of figuring out more people in her life, is understanding those society organizations. Because it says, it tells that she's involved in a lot of things, but among her contributions to community life was the opening of her large home with its facilities to the Wildemar Home Department for an all-day meeting once each month for several years, when the organization had no place to meet. So now I know that she's very involved in the Wildemar Home Department. That means I want to go learn about the Wildemar Home Department, because that gives me some biographical information about her. Also, make sure you're looking for, you might find marriage announcements. Fanny and her husband Ben, they married in a very small town, so they do show up in the paper quite a bit. But I love marriage announcements. Sometimes give us like what they were dressed in, or what flowers they carried. Here it says that the bride was prettily gowned in white and carried a bouquet of white and blush carnations. She is Wildemar's school teacher for the present year's term and is much loved for her sterling qualities of mind and soul. And then what's really fun is that whoever the correspondent was for this particular article they wrote a poem for their marriage. And so we get a nice little poem, but I love that it says that the bride was most simply and tastefully dressed in the style and the color that suited her best. So just kind of fun little details about her life and who she was. Gives me a little bit more of that biographical sense of who she was. But also look for those society news, the gossip columns, who's doing what, where, who's traveled where. Here we get a notice that Miss Souls of Los Angeles will be our teacher for the coming term. That was in 1906. Or she's expected to spend her 2 weeks vacation from teaching with relatives in Los Angeles. Well, that tells me something. She was from Michigan, so she must have some relatives in Los Angeles, and I need to figure out who those are. And then you might get other things, like here in the society columns, Mrs. J.D. Souls and two sons, Neil and Roy, arrived at Wildemar last week from Reed City, Michigan. They are the mother and brothers of Mrs. B.F. Taylor, who's Miss Souls, and expect to make their home in California. And then above that is an article about Roy, who's one of her brothers. And then down below is actually the birth announcement of her first son. So it's kind of interesting to see that, her mother and brothers came out to live in Southern California at about the same time she had a child. So clearly there was a plan in place for her mother to come help out. And this is actually my grandfather's birth announcement. And I love it because there's no clue it's a birth announcement unless you look at the date and realize who he is. But it just says he arrived at Wildemar last week, and under our climactic conditions, his voice is growing stronger each day. And it says that he will decide to locate permanently in this land of life-giving health, sunshine, and flowers, which again, you wouldn't realize is a birth announcement unless you kind of work that in with a couple of other things. In addition to looking for records that name women, one of the big strategies is that you always need to focus on records that name men or other family members. So we've already discussed a lot of these records, things like land records, probate records, court records. We've discussed them from a woman's perspective, except remember that Dower Rights, those are really her husband's records, though she's named. But make sure that you're looking for all of the records of all of her family, because you just don't know what record might give you some clues. So death certificates, for example, have a place that says the maiden name of the mother, especially 20th century death certificates. So here's a Claude Russell Henry and his mother's name, Berta May Elkins. So you need to find death records for all of her children, because that might give you some clues, especially if you're trying to find a maiden name. Don't forget county histories. County histories are so much fun. County histories were published usually, especially if you're looking at ones published in the late 1800s. But they would have these sections that are just biographies of local men. I'm not sure that I've ever seen a biography in a county history of a woman, but they will give details about that man's ancestors, usually including his mother. So here we have an example, a man named David J. Ambler, and it says they were talking about the Ambler family. They talk about this couple's son, Andrew, who's David's father. It says that Andrew, the father of David J. Ambler, was married 14th of May, 1829, to Mary Johnson, the daughter of Benjamin and Abigail Johnson of Richland, Bucks County, and this is Pennsylvania, and the Johnson family was of German descent. How cool is that? And for those of you who know anything about Pennsylvania, you'll know that they didn't keep marriage records at that time period. So now we have the marriage date and the maiden name of David's mother. So if you were researching David's mother, that's why you want to find county histories for her sons, and even for her sons-in-law, because again, they might be giving some information there. Here's an example of a land deed. In addition to the Dower Right, there are times where we'll get couples and families. So this says, know all men by these presents that we, Ruel Murphy and Elizabeth, his wife, late Elizabeth Gearhart, and James McClure and Susan, his wife, late Susan Gearhart, all of the county of Clark and state of Missouri, children and heirs of one Peter Gearhart, deceased, late of the county of Cumberland and state of Kentucky. So again, for both Susan and Elizabeth, we get their married names and we get their maiden names. So we're tying identity together. We're creating that connection. Here's an example of a will. And it always surprises me when you run across these things, because I'm like, yeah, why would you give anything about the wife's family in your will? But this is the will of, I'm trying to remember, of Cleaver Worley. And he says, I give, bequeath, and devise to my wife, Anne Eliza Worley, whose maiden name was no deed. So randomly in the middle of his will, he's giving us the maiden name of his wife. That's pretty awesome. And also make sure, as part of this, you're looking for who else is in the household and census records, and especially those 1850, 1860, and 1870 census when no relationships are listed. So here we have an example, and we looked earlier, we saw a headstone for a Sarah Klaus. So here we have Sarah Klaus with her husband Jacob in the 1850 census. And one thing that I want to point out here is that you want to pay attention to the household columns. So the first column is the number of dwelling in order of visitation, and the next one's the number of family in order of visitation. In this case, we have one dwelling, it says 2, but 3 households in the same building. So one dwelling, 3 households, don't you think those 3 families are probably related? So you want to pay attention to the other people in the same dwelling, or who are in the same household but have a different surname. Who are those people? Because even if later on they list themselves as a servant, it still could be a niece or somebody like that. But in this case, we really have 3 households. So we have these other 2 households are in the same with Sarah and with Jacob. So a household of George and Mary Bubach, Jacob and Sarah Klaus, and then David and Elizabeth Byers. And when you look at the birth years for Mary and Sarah, they are actually of really good age to be the older daughters of David and Elizabeth, which they are, with a little bit additional research. But again, they're all in the same household, but with different surnames. Again, that issue of the changing surnames and figuring out identity with women, you have to be paying attention to all of those other details. Okay, so let's just kind of end the class with some strategies for tracing women. We've already kind of talked about fan club research, which is researching family, associates, and neighbors. But remember that when you go to try and find a woman's family, her family are probably going to be in the records of her husband and maybe of her children. So if you don't know a woman's brothers and parents, you need to be researching the men in her life completely. So, did he buy some property from a man for a really small consideration, meaning like he should have been spending, $500 and he only spent $50. Look for things like witnesses on land records, neighbor, your family are there right around you. Oftentimes you'll have them witnesses. They might be neighbors, whether on land or census records. Consider marriage bonds for states with marriage bonds. A marriage bond is traditionally signed by the groom and a member of the bride's family. So if you aren't paying attention to that, you might be missing that there's her father or her brother or her guardian listed right there on her marriage bond. Oftentimes, if children, now guardians are there to protect the financial interest of a child in an estate or a minor or an incompetent individual, but the person who's appointed as a guardian is oftentimes a member of the widow's family. So if a husband dies and somebody's appointed as guardian for the family, see who he is, because he could be related to the widow. Pay attention to things like executors or administrators, especially if you're looking at like migration cases where they moved, from, like we saw one that moved from Kentucky to Missouri. Look for other people who make that same migration and then appear in the records with them, who come from the same place at the same time and settle nearby. Again, the big issue with tracing the woman's family is that the surnames are constantly changing, and so you're not always sure what surname you're looking for. A couple other strategies: look at names. Naming patterns are huge. A woman's maiden name could be used as a middle name for one of her children, or I've seen a lot of women's the maiden name get used as a first name, and then that first name over time almost becomes a first name. But I still remember one that I was tracking for a while. His name was Sidwell Taylor, and I was like, Sidwell is such an unusual name, but his mother's maiden name was Sidwell, so that's where he got it. Make sure that you're looking for a woman under all of her surnames. When a woman divorced, she can petition the court to go back to an earlier name, and I've even seen cases where the judge has denied the petition and she did it anyway, because we're not quite the tracking people like we are today. So but she might go back not to her maiden name but to a previous husband's name if she's been married more than once. So kind of look under all those surnames and be aware of all of those surnames. Or I was talking to a coworker, he has one where a woman had married before 1880. She remarried before 1880, but for some reason on the 1880 census, she's still listed with the surname before her marriage for whatever reason. So make sure that you're kind of looking, you kind of almost need to have a page that's just, these are all the names that she goes by. And in addition to doing that with surnames, you got to get to know the nicknames that are common for given names. Mary is Polly, Sarah is Sally. Some of those you get to know, and then some of them are a little bit more unique. And you're trying to think, okay, what are the nicknames for Ellen? Nellie? That's a little unusual, but sure. I have one, Matilda, who is a Tilly. Margaret could be Daisy or Peggy. Get to know those nicknames, because again, as you're searching or you're trying to find these women, you have to know all of their names, all the different surnames, all the different given names. Also learn about your ancestors' ethnic group, because there can be some unique situations going on. I mentioned earlier that we've got English common law, and then you have what's called civil law. And because under civil law, women maintain a separate legal identity, married women do, and they use their maiden names. And so for some French and Italian women who, when they're immigrating, may be immigrating under their maiden name, not their married name. So you need to understand that. Also keep in mind that a lot of times women, who, as they would arrive, especially if you settle in big cities, you end up within a neighborhood that's pretty much all has the same country of origin, which means that you may never learn English. You may kind of continue living in that scenario as a woman, living within that kind of culture that you came from. So you're less likely to show up in records that are in English, to start looking for records in that language, whether those are church records or ethnic newspapers or whatever you can find. That's where those women are going to appear, because they kind of still maintain that connection to their country of origin. Make sure that you're not just searching for your married relatives. I mentioned this earlier. I actually think some of the best probates I've ever seen are from single sisters. The sister that never married, because when she dies, she's not just naming her children. She has no children. She names all of her siblings and all of their children. And I've even seen sometimes the siblings' grandchildren, depending on if she outlived everybody else. Make sure that you're looking for every record for your female ancestors. In the men in their lives, really exhaust all of the records. We've talked about a lot of different records today, but there are a lot more out there. think outside the box. I just wanted to show you one kind of unique situation that I ran across, which this is a widow's pension for a woman named Sarah Cleaver, and she was the widow of Mordecai T. Cleaver. But what if I'm actually researching Mordecai's first wife? It turns out that information about the first wife is in the pension because Sarah has to prove that, yes, Mordecai was married prior to her, but that widow, that she's deceased, so that there's not a situation where Mordecai had two wives at the same time. So in the witness affidavits, we actually get some notes about Mordecai's first wife, even though this is the widow's pension of Mordecai's second wife. So here we have this man who says that he was acquainted with Mordecai and with his first wife, and he attended the funerals of both, and that the first wife's name was Ruth Mullen, and that she died at Springboro, Warren County, Ohio in the spring of 1865. Or here is actually a witness affidavit from Ruth's brother, where he actually says, I've been acquainted with Sarah for this long, but I was also acquainted with a soldier who's Mordecai from about 1855 until he died. His first wife was a sister of mine, and they were married about 35 years ago, and she died about 1865. So, I mean, talk about awesome information about the first wife hiding in the second wife's pension, pension application. So kind of if you have this goal, I want to find a maiden name, just really quickly, what are you going to look for? We'll start with marriage records. That's a great place for maiden names, but look for a woman's death records and her obituaries. Trace her until her death, and then take all of her children and trace them until their deaths. Think about kind of what records give maiden names of mothers. For example, a Social Security application in the 1930s could give you the maiden name of a woman from the 19th century. Search for the records of her spouse as well, and also consider those people in the same household on census records. Who are they? Because we could be seeing other family members, but because of the surname issue, we're just not spotting them. We're not recognizing that's who they are. Also, if your strategy then is to find the parents, first off, you have to find the maiden name. So do all those steps first. But kind of think about there's two approaches. One is if you look at the date and place where they married. Remember that couples traditionally marry at the place of the bride's residence. So that might be a good place to start looking for her family. And also identify her husband's fan club, those families, associates, and neighbors. And then search for both of those groups. So who's got her surname, her maiden name, because you should know the maiden name in the area where they first married. And then also people in her fan club. Those are that's going to give you your foundational group. And then you start looking for men with her surname or men who appear in the fan club in that same area as they married, assuming that they actually did marry at the place of the bride's residence. And then you want to find every record to kind of put all of this together. The hope being that at some point you might be able to find the probate record of a father that names her with her husband's surname. But that doesn't always happen. So again, it can get a little complicated. And then if your goal is to kind of track down biographical details, think about, it's a lot less likely you're going to find things that, really tell you this woman, this was exactly what her life was like. So what you need to do is to start really understanding everything about her and her world. Think about what life was like in that time period and location. Things like mortality rates. How often did people die? How often did children die? What age would she have died at? Look for diaries, letters, and journals for men and women, especially anything associated with that time period and location. Because even though you might not find anything that she wrote herself, you might be able to find, letters or a diary of somebody nearby that gives you a sense of what her life was like, or may even name her if she was a neighbor to that person. Read county and state and social histories of the time and the places where she lived. See what's kind of going on in her world. Look a lot at local churches and social movements. Women are very, very active in religious organizations. When we had the Great Awakenings that came through, in the 1700s and early 1800s, actually, there's kind of some guesses that women joined churches about 2 to 1 to men. They're way more involved in religious organizations. So look beyond just the traditional church records, like birth, marriages, and burials, or baptisms, burials, and burials. See if there's things like, the minutes of the church, or if there's membership lists or anything else that survived for that particular religious organization. She may be very, very involved. And then you kind of can combine that with newspapers. Like we talked about, there's so much information in newspapers that could also give you some clues. And then ask a lot of questions of the records. Don't just look at the record and say, oh, that's cool, but think, okay, well, what was it like for her to live like that? Then the 1940 census says she only had a 5th grade education. I wonder why that was. What was going on in her life? Start asking those questions can give you a better sense of what's going on, her kind of her biographical details about her life. You might even have a woman that you could, if you do all of this, that all you'll ever find is 1 or 2 records with her name, but you can still tell her story if you're willing to kind of go out and look at that community and the social history and the letters and all the other things out there that give you a sense of what her world was like in the time that she lived. So all of this kind of comes back to this idea that, let's not leave women to be forgotten. Let's not let them be hidden. Go out and learn about who they were, because they're there and they're part of our past as much as our male ancestors. Just because the records sometimes hide them doesn't mean they're not worth pursuing. Okay, kind of in conclusion, we went through some history and background. We talked about the laws and the records, talked about a few other records. We talked about some strategies, specifically looking for the records of men to trace women. But just kind of, like I said, they're out there. Don't let them be forgotten. See if you can figure out even just little bits and pieces here and there of who they were and to tell their story, because we don't want our female ancestors to be lost to time. So anyway, thank you for joining us. I know I went way over time because lots and lots of content, but are there any questions I could answer really quickly, Tim?
Yeah, Beth, by all the comments, that's I think it's perfectly fine that you went over time. Everybody in the comments is very appreciative of this class, and all the comments are basically saying either excellent or fantastic presentation. So just a wealth of information and a great job. So let's get on to some of the questions. Diana says, do you have any tips for finding info about women who married a cousin so they have the same last name?
I think it's just the same tips, even whether they have the same name and they could be a cousin, or maybe they have the same name and they're not a cousin. The same kinds of things. You just go out and pursue all the records and make sure that you're really, really exhausting the resources and see if you can sort out that relationship. I don't know that there's anything unique to cousins, except for, you do want to look at the marriage laws of the state that you're dealing with, because sometimes it's illegal to marry specific cousins. Isn't that called consanguinity? Maybe you can say that, Tim, that I can't, but.
Consanguinity?
It's consanguinity.
Or consanguinity. Yeah. It's in the back of my brain. I knew it started with consang, but I mean, look at what the laws are, because if you think they're first cousins, you might want to double check on that. That could be illegal. And so then you might want to double say, okay, maybe they're not first cousins, maybe they were second cousins or something else. You have to figure out what the law allows in the state that they got married.
Pat asks, if a woman divorced pre-1850, where would I look for documentation on the divorce? So
it depends on the state. If you're in the southern state, I would start with the chancery courts. I'm still trying to figure out some of the divorce stuff with the New England states, but it really depends on the states and the state laws. Not all states had chancery courts, but the states that did divorce tended to be in chancery courts. But don't forget to look at the legislative actions on this behalf of the state, because a lot of divorces were granted by the state itself, by the government. So you'd actually have to file a private petition and to your local senator or congressman who would take it, and then you would get the divorce granted that way.
Marjorie, did Dower Rights not exist in Western states because those were newer states?
So the reason that Dower Rights didn't exist in Western states is actually not because they're new, but because most of those states are based on Spanish civil law, because they were originally Hispanic state areas settled by the Spanish. And then, of course, Mexico, and then we had the Mexican-American War. And so you'll notice, though, other than, it's California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, those are states that are heavily impacted by Spanish law. And under Spanish law, women were independent legally and could own property. And so instead of having dower, they had it was called community property, meaning that the couple as a whole, the couple together. And most states today recognize community property, from what I understand, though I'm not an expert in modern law at all, but But that's one of the reasons why they didn't have dower, was because you can't have dower if you own it equally. Dower is only when the husband owns it and the wife just has the interest in it.
Asha, I hope I'm pronouncing, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your first name wrong. Asha, were married women's property acts not valid for African American women?
As far as I know, that they were valid for everybody. I don't know that there might have been some limitations later on, especially when you bring in Jim Crow laws that would make it a much harder for African American women to own property. But I don't think initially that was a concern. From what I understand, the acts themselves never distinguished that. And you will find that African American women own property. I mean, we're kind of figuring that they, even like the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, being a woman didn't disqualify you from taking advantage of some of those benefits, especially in that post-1865 time period. I think, though, we do still have that tendency for the men to buy the property because that's kind of how it's always been done. But I don't know that those actually had any, those particular acts had any qualifications. But I've only looked really closely at the acts for New York and Pennsylvania. So you might want to go and actually pick the state you're interested in and research the Married Women's Property Acts for your state. And that's where it gets tough in the US to say anything is true universally, because every state's going to do it slightly differently or their own way or have their own laws. So you have to get to know the laws for your state for that record type at that time period.
Okay. Same question here from a number of women. Number of participants. Did the woman who married an alien become a citizen of her husband's country, or was she not a citizen of any country?
I think that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that the US would consider her a citizen of that country, but I don't know if that country would consider her a citizen of that country. So again, that would be country specific. You'd have to research what that country says. But most of the time, they've never left the country. They stayed in the U.S. So in that example I showed, Mexico probably doesn't even know this woman exists or whether she's a citizen or not, and they probably don't care because she's not coming to Mexico. But yeah, you would have to research the specific country and find out if they consider her a citizen. But no, I think the U.S. did consider her a citizen of that country that her husband was a citizen of, because of derivative citizenship is somehow tied to her husband more than to herself.
Okay. A couple more here. If a woman remarries after a divorce, do they also change their middle name or middle initial to represent their maiden names or their past married names?
So if a woman changes her name remarrying a divorce, I think middle names are really a choice. I don't know that there's any laws that dictate how middle names. So she might change the middle name or middle initial, or she might not, or she might stop using one for temporarily. I think that's really up to her. But I don't know that there's any kind of standard practice in terms of that, in terms of middle names.
I'll throw something in here. Yeah, I don't think, like you said, I don't think there's any standard. I think it's totally up to them on how they represent themselves. Back in the day, there wasn't really any law. I mean, that a lot of these people chose a middle name. When they were christened, they didn't have a middle name, but later in life, they picked a middle name for themselves. It just went that way. So
yeah, middle names and even your own name is a lot more fluid. I mean, modernly, there's all this, you go to court to change your name, but historically, that wasn't the case. I mean, she got married and she just started using her husband's name. There was no other than the marriage, no legal document that said she had changed her name. So I think that's the case with middle names even more so. If you want to use it or you don't want to use it, it's totally up to you. The big situation I think I see a lot more middle names is when there's multiple men of the same name in the same area, and they might make them all use middle initials to, well, that's John Smith and that's John W. Smith and that's John T. Smith. And and that's John T. Smith Jr. is a way to distinguish the different men with the same name.
Maria, when a woman became a U.S. citizen, were her minor children also granted citizenship?
Yes, yeah. Minor children, I think even today, I was trying to figure out, are qualified. It's called derivative citizenship still. Yep. It's just that women no longer qualify for or women of legal age are no longer qualifying for derivative citizenship, based on her marital status. But yeah, under children who are under legal age, and that age will change over time, also do qualify for derivative citizenship status.
And we're going to go with one more question here. Where do we find women World War II records?
I was trying to look into this a little bit. There's a great book publication, and I'm trying to remember the full title, that's put out by the National Archives about tracing women in the U.S. military service. It's apologize, it's sitting on my desk at the library right now because I was looking through it. My guess is that they have the exact same kinds of records that you have for men, like service records and stuff like that. So I would start by reaching out to the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. But I'm guessing, and this is something I didn't get a chance to look into, was whether the 1973 fire may have impacted those records as well. I think they did.
Yeah, I think they did too. I think they're all kept in basically the same area.
Yeah, so if they were in the Army in World War I or World War II, you're probably not gonna, those are the records that are definitely destroyed. But if they were in one of those Navy corps, they might have survived. And at the time, the Air Force was part of the Army, so a lot of those were also destroyed. But if you have a sense of when and where they served, there's always other records to look at. They just don't have the service files anymore. But yeah, I'd start by reaching out to the National Personnel Records Centers, where I'd start.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Beth. Again, a wonderful class. All the comments very complimentary. And we thank all of you for joining us today for our webinar. Just a few reminders for you, though. This class was live streamed on the Family Search channel on YouTube, and a recording of this will be available as soon as this class ends. However, the recording will only be available for a limited time. Excuse me. Again, very important that if you need help with a specific research problem, please sign up for a virtual consultation with one of the library's research specialists. As always, we would love to help you, and I've got one in about 15 minutes. The next class which will be taught will be this coming Monday, taught by the Family History Library using the Family History Family Search Catalog. That's on Monday, June the 7th at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Again, we thank all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our future presentations. And again, if you have any personal research questions, please sign up for a research consultation. Again, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Beth, good job. Wonderful class. Bye-bye.